The undercover policing inquiry, also known as the spycops inquiry, is a statutory government inquiry into undercover policing in England and Wales. Initiated by Theresa May in 2015, it's been looking into allegations of abuse, dishonesty, and criminality in the conduct of undercover police since 2017. The first tranche of the inquiry concluded last year after examining the activities of the Metropolitan Police's Special Operations Squad between 1968 and 1982. It revealed a coordinated effort of deeply illegal activity by police to infiltrate and sabotage progressive movements in Britain. Tranche 2 of the inquiry was opened earlier this year, looking into the conduct of undercover police from the early 1980s into the 90s. Included in that period is the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence, who was beaten to death in 1993. And significantly, the efforts undercover police made to infiltrate groups seeking justice for the 18-year-old black man. One black police officer, who used the name Anthony Lewis, has already been revealed by the inquiry to have spied on the Lawrence family's campaign to bring Stephen's killers to justice. His real name is Trevor Morris, and he spent 4 years pretending to be a left-wing anti-racist campaigner. And in his efforts to gather information on the Lawrence family's campaign, he deceived women into a long-term relationship using his fake identity. Trevor Morris has been giving further evidence at the inquiry, which is live-streamed. Except, as Morris was discussing the police's role in discrediting the Lawrence family, this happened.
Did he say anything to you to the effect that he'd been asked to gather intelligence with which to smear the Lawrence family?
I heard this subsequently, and I thought that was, no disrespect to Peter, I thought nonsense. That's not what we're about. We're about gathering intelligence, not smearing individuals. That's a security service job. Let them do that. We're bothered about gathering intelligence. That's what we were doing.
Just to be clear.
Sorry, I shouldn't say that.
Just to be clear, you are. Are you not?
Let's scrap that last bit. I'm not saying that.
Are you or are you not in a position to say whether or not the security service was seeking to smear?
That was the inquiry's stream cutting out. Just at the moment, the activities of the British security services were coming into view. And the stream was all suspended for almost an hour before inquiry chair John Mitting was broadcast making these remarks.
Ms. Barr, before you resume, may I say to those behind that there is a purpose in these orders. I know that you have complied with them up to now. They are serious orders. They do have a potentially serious consequence if they're breached. Please, I ask of you as well as demand of you, comply with what the order requires you to do. A transcript in due course will be published, which will contain part of that which was said between the hours of 11:16 and 11:22, but only part of it.
I'm joined now by Tom Fowler, host of the Spycops podcast, who has been covering undercover policing inquiry extensively. Tom, can you first tell us more about this extraordinary moment in the inquiry earlier today? What was your reaction to it?
To be honest, it wasn't anything that we didn't already know. We've been very well aware that the role of the Special Demonstration Squad and the relationship that it has with the security service was one of like a customer relationship, that they, as you heard Trevor Morris saying there, they collected the evidence and they passed it on to the security services. I mean, it goes deeper than that. Essentially, the security services would provide shopping lists, as they called them, of specific information they wanted to know about campaigners, about organizations. And they passed that information then was passed on back from the SDS to the security services who would act on it.
Moments like this will get a lot of attention, but there's a huge amount coming out from the inquiry that isn't getting nearly as much attention as this. As it probably needs, to be frank. You've been just in the inquiry, I should say to our audience. That's why you are sat on a train station, because you literally just come out. What are you seeing in this inquiry that feels of particular significance that might not get quite as much attention as this blooper?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just to recap who the SDS were, the spycops. This was a secret undercover unit of political police, part of Special Branch, who were deployed into pretty much anyone across the left, the entirety of progressive forces, very, very little infiltration of the far right. They were deployed for about 5 years. They would take the name of a dead child and they would assume that identity, and not just the name, but everything about the identity. They would travel to where that person was born. They would spy on the family. They would get an idea of where they would have gone to school, where they might have ended up working, and use that as the basis of their legend. Many of them deceived women into long-term intimate relationships for many years on end, and in some cases father children with them. I mean, we'd established that before the inquiry started. What the inquiry has done really is like kind of fill in all the detail. I mean, there are many shocking examples of things that happened. I mean, we've been hearing a lot about the Welling protest against the BNP headquarters. We've seen the sort of the intelligence reports leading up to that, which Trevor Morris in this case was filing, and a number of undercover officers, which was really like hyping up that supposedly the anti-Nazi League were going to burn down the bookshop, and really led to the extreme over-policing and the incredibly violent day that day. What happened at Welling, it was a bit of it's referred to by Lindsay Sherman, who convened the Stop the War Coalition, who was on the Central Committee of the SWP at the time, as a medieval battlefield. And we really see the sort of, the relationship that existed between these spy cops and the rest of the infrastructure of repression that exists in the UK. Little detail is by itself not particularly newsworthy, but when you put it together, you kind of really get a picture of how pernicious and how widespread this undermining of political protest groups in the UK has been since 1968. I mean, the unit was shut down in the late 2000s, but was sort of replaced by another unit called the National Public Order Intelligence Unit that was only shut down when Mark Kennedy was exposed in 2010. Since then, I'm sure it exists now in some form, but it really gives us an idea of how much the British state, how far the British state is willing to go to stop political protest.
Really quite a speculative question, maybe a sort of conspiratorial one in a way. But what's your sense of what has changed or not changed in undercover policing up until the present?
It's hard to know, right? The more you know about a specific historical period, the less you want to speculate on the current sort of scenario. There's nothing to suggest that things have changed in terms of what the police want to know. I'm sure the methods have changed quite significantly. I mean, we live in an era of neoliberal policing, right? So, there's a lot of subbing out to private contractors that happens across the board. We know that the criminal informants database is enormous, so that's going to be a huge part of it as well. And of course, there's all the electronic surveillance that's now possible, which wasn't for the majority of the history of the Special Demonstration Squad. But in terms of like what Special Branch are doing in terms of desk roles, that won't have changed in the slightest. It'll just be a tactical change. This is the thing, when people talk about what we've learned in terms of what we can apply to the current day, it's not really about the tactics they use so much, but more what they're interested in. And what we see of that is these huge, huge lists of names, addresses, personal information, connections, physical descriptions, everything about people. This is then fed into what they called vetting, what we call blacklisting, where they would make sure that people who were involved in political protests were unable to get work in areas of influence in the UK, whether that was the civil service, the BBC, or other situations. I mean, we had an example the other day of someone who was spied upon. We saw the reports. He was somebody who was homosexual, and it was pointed out that he was though he was out within the political group he was in, he wasn't in his general life, and he was working for the civil service. And this was an opportunity to entrap him and use him as a proxy. A lot of the sort of recruiting of informers is done, would appear through that kind of blackmail as opposed to, kind of paying them off or whatever else people might think.
This inquiry is moving really quite slowly through the history of the scandal, so we're still a long way from the present day. And I'm wondering what you think is coming up in the inquiry that people should keep their eyes open for. Obviously, things like this they can't really plan for, but is anything in particular coming up that you think people should be aware of?
Very much. I mean, we're about to have a break in the inquiry again at the end of this, in a couple of days' time. We're just coming to the end of this phase. The second phase starts again in September. We'll be hearing from a lot of the more famous undercover officers like Bob Lambert and John Dines. Bob Lambert had 4 relationships while he was deployed undercover and fathered 1 child. He firebombed the Debenhams whilst supposedly as an animal rights activist. He went on to lead the unit. He went on to be involved in the setting up of the Muslim contact unit and wrote Prevent, essentially. We heard about John Dines, who infiltrated London Greenpeace. He had a long-term relationship with Helen Steele. He famously wrote part of the What's Wrong with McDonald's leaflet that led to McLibel.
You said they infiltrated the left, but not so much the far right. While you're in the inquiry today, Keir Starmer announced a new unit to deal with the type of far-right riots we've seen over the last few days. I was wondering if you have any immediate comments on that unit and whether or not you think that will be effective at dealing with that kind of problem.
Whatever they say it will be used against, you can bet your bottom dollar that the state will just use it for like a wide range of social control. We only need to look at what's happened to Just Stop Oil recently, the preemptive arrests of Youth Demand Justice Now before the King's speech. Whatever supposed reason the legislation is put in place to launch these kind of units, they'll be used against progressive forces. I'm not entirely convinced they'll be used against the far right in the same way. They certainly haven't historically. During this phase of hearings, we've heard from one officer who infiltrated the far right. Unlike all the other officers who went in for like 5 years and gave detailed reports, he was in for 10 months, gave a handful of reports, and withdrew himself as soon as it got difficult in any way. There's a huge difference in the way in which the state approaches what it considers to be problematic groups on the left. And as we've heard from some of the undercover officers, when they were talking about the National Front in the 1970s, they claimed they weren't a problem because they cooperated with the police, they believed in the Queen. There's a very different sort of approach to the way that the far right gets dealt with by the state.